Okay, today's lecture we're going to cover poisons, both intentional, unintentional, illicit street drugs, so drug overdoses, accidental drug overdoses, and then caustic substances. So let's begin. Okay, so these definitions are important that you know and understand the difference between them. The first one we're going to talk about is misuse. So misuse is when somebody is self-administering a drug without proper medically necessitated control. So that would be taking too many ibuprofen. So even looking at the bottle and it says it's 200 milligrams and take 1 to 2 every 4 to 6 hours. So misuse would be taking, well, let's take 4, or taking them every 2 hours without a medical professional saying, okay, you can take up to this amount, or you can take it at this time instead. So if you're not guided by a physician for even over-the-counter drugs. Misuse would also be taking prescribed drugs from somebody else. Oh, so-and-so said that I could just take one of their Vicodin because I've had this really bad accident and I just don't want to go to the doctor. So that would be considered misuse. It steps up or can step up from misuse to abuse. And this happens when it's purposeful, it's repetitive, and it's non-medical. So taking a Percocet when you drink because it makes you feel good, which highly do not recommend that. But so abuse knows it's we're taking too much or taking something that we do not need, and we're doing it recreationally, or we like the feeling, and it goes from misuse and something that may be innocent or that we're not aware of we're doing to an abuse this is when it becomes purposeful. And then addiction is when we psychologically and or physically are dependent on this drug. So not being able to function physically or mentally without having this drug. Methamphetamine is a good example of this. Our body does not physically become dependent on it, it psychologically becomes dependent on it. My sister used to work before she finished school for the American Addiction Centers of America and helping place people who would reach out to go to rehabs. And she would say that insurance companies are more likely to fully pay for rehabilitation for heroin and alcohol because your body physically withdraws from those drugs when you do not have them anymore. And you can physically go into a bad detox and you can die from withdrawal. Whereas cocaine and methamphetamine, it's going to be physically unpleasant, but you're not necessarily going to die from that withdrawal. It's more of a psychological effect. Okay, so here we have the routes of administration. Okay, so this is how we get the drugs into the body. These are the routes of administration. The first one we have is ingested. So eat or drink. So I like to look at this little picture of Alice in Wonderland, and she ingested lots of poisons and mind-altering substances throughout that movie. She ingested them, so eat or drink. Inhaled, that's pretty self-explanatory. Huffing, and this isn't just like drug overdoses. This is poisons as well. So carbon monoxide is going to be a poison. Pesticides, cleaning agents. So if you're in the bathroom and you're cleaning and you're mixing a bunch of chemicals, which you should not do, and those TikToks that do it drive me crazy all the time because it's chemistry and eventually you're going to have a caustic substance, and if you inhale it, it's going to poison you. So inhalation would be route number 2. Route number 3 would be absorption. So that would be contact through the skin. So skin contact and mucous membranes. And then injected as well. So we can have injections in infusions that we are supposed to have. And then we have illicit street drugs as well that can be injected. And what happens is that any route in the body absorbs it, it's going to produce a chemical change. So we have a chemical change in the body. And that chemical change causes a harmful effect. Okay, so these upcoming slides have the information has been retrieved from Poison Control website, and this slide says in 2018. So in 2021, which are the most recent statistics on their website, it's about over 2 million poisonings in 2021, so 2.08 million. So about the same amount, maybe just a little more. The highest incident is 1-year-olds to 2.5-year-olds, accounted for the most amount of poisonings. And most poisonings under the age of 6 are actually usually unintentional, right? They're playing in the garage, they're playing outside, they find a really bright colored liquid and they ingest it. They see mommy putting on her makeup, they get into medications they shouldn't. So the majority of poisonings under the age of 6 are unintentional. So just know that. So 75% of poisonings are actually unintentional, and that's with all age groups. Poison control is a good resource for anybody, both professional and in the community. So hospitals use poison control to have advice on treatments, what to administer next, what not to administer, so what's contraindicated, blood work that needs to be taken, what labs need to be taken, what we need to be looking for, and what we can expect. And then they will also have antidotes that can be used with poisonings to reverse them or lessen the symptoms. So you can find the poison control online at the website or at that phone number below. So the poison control has now broken down their statistics based on unintentional poisonings and intentional poisonings. And then you can see they also break it down by age as well. So it starts with less than 6 years, 6 to 12, teens, adults, and then it gives you the percentage of all ages. So in general, 46% of poisonings were unintentional that have just a general cause. Environmental poisonings were next. So environmental, think pesticides, think carbon monoxide exposures to gases, those type of things. Occupational, you can see, look, the younger kids, it's going to be mostly adults. So that's going to be working in a mechanic shop, working in somewhere that makes varnishes and stains. That's going to be occupational. A therapeutic error, so that would be accidentally giving too much of something. Misuse, so back to that definition, misuse, taking too many ibuprofen, not being able to wait the full 6 hours. So that is going to be adults, and then 6 to 12, right? Because when we are giving medications to our children, we need to be using weight, not necessarily age, because Marilyn, when she was little, she was 4 and she was very small. So if I would have looked at the 4-year-old instead of giving her a medication that was based on her weight, I may have accidentally been giving her too much. Bites and stings. So scorpion stings, spider bites. And the poison control is nationwide. So this isn't looking just at Colorado. Food poisoning is pretty low, and then unknown. So 75% of total poison control calls were unintentional. Okay. This slide is kind of disturbing, so you know, take your time to process it. I'm not going to quiz you on or test you on any of these numbers. So if you feel like you can't process this slide, then go ahead, take a minute and fast forward through this part, and I'll just pause for a second. Okay, so unfortunately, with poisonings and overdoses, we do see unintentional, but we also see a fair amount of intentional. Again, this is something that I know I have talked to you and Derek has talked to you about making sure that you can handle and process and you have a person to reach out to. You have a way that you can journal, you go to the gym, whatever you can do, because we do see some very sad stories. So, intentional suicides. Um, it's actually, this is very disturbing to me because you can see the highest amount would be in teenagers here. Intentional suspected suicide at 55%. So that's extremely alarming, especially being a mom of a daughter she's almost 12 years old. So that's definitely something that really bothers me. Mental health is very important. It's very important that you take care of yourself and you have people that you can reach out to. Intentional misuse. So that would be if you've ever seen the movie Empire Records, and there's a character, Corey, who is constantly taking uppers, so like diet pills, so she can stay awake and she can do her homework, and she knows she's misusing, and then it can turn to abuse, right? So we have misuse, and then we have abuse, and that can lead to addiction. And then intentional not knowing. They don't know. So here's a story for you. My late brother-in-law, who had committed suicide, we assume it's intentional suspected suicide because he passed. We're not sure if it was an unknown or a suspected suicide. So this is something that if you suspect somebody is mentally not in a great place, reach out to them, reach out to others around them, and give them support. If you are not in a good place either, and you need someone to reach out here, I am always here for you. The staff's always here for you, and we can get you in contact with people to help you with your mental health. Okay, so here we have poisonings broken down by category, and then what's the percentage that we saw that the poison control saw, and the highest being cosmetics, personal care products. So those are going to be more likely to affect younger children, getting into them, overusing them, ingesting them. And then cosmetics are absorbed, so you can have poisonings if somebody has like an allergic reaction to them. Maybe they're buying personal care products that are not FDA approved, maybe from another country, that could cause illness. Cleaning substances, so that could be ingestion, inhalation, um, accidental, purposeful. Analgesics, which are pain meds, and those are going to be typically the highest, and I think we go over that later in this presentation. The medication that is more likely to cause an overdose or a poisoning is going to be analgesics or pain medications. And analgesics aren't just opiates, they're also NSAIDs, so Advil, ibuprofen, Aleve, and then Tylenol as well. Dietary supplements, herbal supplements, so things like hydroxycut, caffeine pills that are used, anything that you can buy over the counter. Foreign bodies, toys, magnets will cause poisoning. Batteries as well would fit into this category. Vitamins, antihistamines like Benadryl. Benadryl overdoses are awful. They're terrible. They cause convulsions. We had a teenager come in who took a bunch of was in a Target aisle and took a ton of Benadryl, and then they have random convulsions. They're not having actual seizures, but the muscle twitching is very severe. So it's not the brain activity that's causing the convulsions. It's really crazy to see. He did make it. We flushed his system, but it was really hard to witness. And getting an ABG on those patients are not fun either. Topical preparations. So you could have anything from over-the-counter to prescribed topical medications. Using too much of them, using expired drugs as well can cause poisonings. Plants and then pesticides would be the least amount of causes for substances. Okay, let's talk about what happens in the body when we become poisoned. So number one would be the biochemical change. So this can inactivate our enzymes in our body. So with the inactivation of enzymes and proteins, that's what's going to lead to actual cellular change, which is step number two. So we've moved from step one to step two. We have actual cellular change now. And that cellular change can either decrease or increase nerve activity. So depending on the poison and what it is, we can have stimulants, for example, and those stimulants increase neural activity. So people are hyper and talking a million miles a minute and are all over the place. They're diaphoretic, they may be flushed, or we could have decreased nerve activity. So we have shallow respirations. People are talking really slow. They may have a hard time keeping their eyes open. So it can be one or the other, or they can go back and forth depending on the stage, the amount, the severity, but we have nerve change. The cellular change will eventually lead to cellular death because we are no longer having the enzymes and proteins that are needed to continue cell life. When we have cellular death, the death of those cells release endotoxins, and those endotoxins can cause sepsis. And then sepsis can lead to septic shock. So depending on where we're at in the poisoning, how long they take before they seek medical attention, or if they don't have access to medical care, they can be further in the process. And the third step, the organ systems start to feel the change. Symptoms are also seen, so we can have cellular change and physiological change may be very quickly behind that. So we can take a drug and then we start to have cellular change, and then all of a sudden we start to see symptoms. Or we can have cellular change and boom, pretty fast after the poison is ingested or inhaled, we can see symptoms fairly quickly. So it's going to vary depending on the substance. At this point, and especially getting towards an end of physiological change, we're not exchanging oxygen and CO2 properly. So that whatever the chemical is, it's binding, it's taking its effects, and we're not effectively transporting gases. We have a decreased amount of nutrients, and this is going to cause ischemia. So I want you to know the 3 steps and know what happens in each stage. Okay, so recognizing poisonings can be easy. It can be completely obvious. Somebody may tell you, I took too much, or this is what I saw them take. Or it can be something that you have to play detective and figure out what is going on with the patients. And every patient's going to present a little bit differently. So it may be completely obvious. It may be subtle, and the response must be made to a suspicion, which is not spelled right, I apologize. But so, for example, mothers with Munchausen, so mom thinking that wanting their child to be sick because they want the attention and they're purposefully making them sick. The most famous case I can think of is Gypsy Rose. So kind of seeing those subtle signs and symptoms and being able to ask those questions so that you can figure out the answers on your own. And make reports as needed. So we're going to take a careful history. Where were you when you started to notice symptoms? What was going on? Were there any empty pill bottles? Past medical history? And then being able, for those suspicions that you may have in those other cases, asking very blanketed questions in a non-confrontational way, right? We want to earn the trust of our patients no matter what the patients are. But when you suspect child abuse or elderly abuse or a domestic abuse, you've got to be very careful and you have to be non-confrontational. If there's no other explanation for acute symptoms, you should suspect some type of poisoning, whether it be intentional or unintentional. And then EMS is going to look around or a friend, a roommate. If there's any pill bottles, they should bring them in. Look for alcohols. Smell is going to be a big one. If you can smell something on their breath that doesn't smell right, that may be a sign as well. So using all of your senses, except for taste, to kind of get the clues of what may be going on with this patient. Okay, so signs and symptoms. For signs and symptoms, you're going to want to combine this with the history. So combine with patient history. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Just like with our snake bites and spider bites and stings, this is something that especially is going to be if we ingest it, even if it's an accidental, so like anaphylaxis as well. I'm allergic to Levaquin, the antibiotic, and when I was wrapped up like that mummy and I was going into anaphylactic shock, I felt like I was going to vomit everywhere. Drugs make me sick. My stomach is very sensitive to drugs. Even the anesthesia drugs from my C-section. I totally threw up after my C-section in the PACU when they were getting me cleaned up. And I just remember saying, I'm so sorry. I can't move very well to help you. So that may be a big sign. Something you should always, always, always have set up is suction. Make sure you always have suction if you suspect a poison. Okay? Always have suction set up in the room. We don't want to risk the patient aspirating. If the patient does vomit, we need to turn them to their left side quickly and suction their mouth out and make sure that we're watching for signs of aspiration. Severe abdominal pain, especially if they ingest it. Pallor, fever, sweating, somnolence. So they're just kind of out of it. They're like really chill, depending on what they took or what kind of poison it is. Hyperexcitability, and this can be physical or emotional. So think of, you have somebody who has taken a lot of methamphetamine. They're going to be bouncing around and all over the place, and you cannot really like tell what way they're going to go. Soapbox moment. Always make sure you're aware of your surroundings. Some drugs will make people feel like they are invincible and nobody can harm them. And so workplace violence, I really want you to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and that you are in a safe position. So if you have somebody who you know are on illicit street drugs, make sure that you are in a safe place and you're not compromising your safety. Okay. So we also, at signs and symptoms, want to look at the route. What's the route of the drug? Do we see sores on the mouth? Did a kiddo ingest something caustic? And so we can see blisters around the mouth. And then we combine that with the smell of their breath. And so we know that they probably ingested something. And they were at a barbecue with their parents and they have a charcoal grill. So they had access to lighter fluid. So it's putting those pieces together. Or are they an IV drug user? And you can see track marks where they inject on their arms. Or we just had a student do a case study who it's called popping, and it really kind of grosses me out, but they inject the drug underneath their skin, and then they like pop it sub Q. I don't know if it's but their legs were full of these welts and these injected marks. So that's going to be the route of administration. Some more signs and symptoms. So note excessive salivation. If we have excessive salivation, that's the body's trying to get something that they ingested out. It's not supposed to be right. But we also need to think, what's going on with their glottis? Do they have airway swelling? Are we worried about their airway? What's going on? So we want to get eyes on that. Redness or blistering around the mouth. I talked about caustic chemicals, usually in kids, where it's ingested. Disturbed level of consciousness. So that could be they don't know who they are. They don't know where they are. It can be um, they're only responding to voice. They're only responding to pain. They're confused. They're not saying the right words. Cyanosis, it doesn't always happen, but will with cyanide poisoning. So when we talk about cyanide poisoning, we'll get into that. So cyanosis doesn't always happen. Just think carbon monoxide poisoning. We have the cherry red lips. So not always, but we do know if we see it, we have tissue hypoxia. An abnormal odor of the tissues. So if we ingest a chemical, we can smell the chemical. If we burn ourselves with a chemical and it's absorbing through our skin, we can smell it that way. Convulsions can happen based on a nervous reaction, like the nervous system reacting. It can also happen due to hypoxia as well. The tissues are just so hypoxic that that's how they're reacting. And a coma. Okay, so let's start about routes of administration. So first we're going to talk about ingestion. A lot of things that are ingested that are poisonous don't have a specific antidote or remedy, but we're still going to call poison control and find out. Sometimes we just have to write it out. Treatments can range from reassurance. So I had a patient one time, I always used to look at the Red Rocks concert schedule during the summer months at St. Anthony's because that's where they're coming. They're coming to us. And I tell you what, the EDM, the techno nights were by far the worst. I had a patient who took acid and thought he could jump off a rock and fly. And I kid you not, that was really the story. And so with acid, there's not much you can do except give them fluid and reassurance. And I couldn't tell you, I sat in his room and held his hand after he self-extubated because the nurse thought he was sedated enough. And she didn't put his restraints back on and self-extubated, but he was okay. He didn't need to be vented anymore. But I held his hand for probably an hour and a half because I was done with my rounds, just reassuring him, letting him know he was safe and he was okay. But he definitely was tripping in the hospital room, so that was an interesting night, to say the least. Or to CPR, right? We can have arrhythmias, we can have hypoxia that causes respiratory arrest, which leads to cardiac arrest. So you can have one extreme to the other. Majority of ingested poisonings are food and drink, especially alcohol is a big one. Alcohol poisoning is a big one. So anytime you have a patient who comes in who's very, very drunk, again, make sure you have suctioning set up in the room. Plants, so somebody ate the wrong mushrooms or random berries in the woods, all kinds of weird things have happened, or drugs, both legal and illegal. Okay, the order of treatment for ingestive poisonings. So at the hospital, we're going to dilute using an IV. At home, we can use water or milk depending on the severity, but we want to dilute, we want to decrease the concentration of the poison. And then the second, we can induce vomiting. So we can make vomiting happen. That's going to depend on how recent the ingestion was, because if it's not still in their stomach, there's no point in having them vomit. We're going to use syrup of ipecac. If the patient is unconscious or it's a caustic poison that caused the poisoning, we will not vomit. If the patient's unconscious and they're vomiting, they have a huge risk of aspiration, so we will skip this step. If the person ingested a caustic poison, it's going to burn and scar and do terrible tissue damage on the way down, so it's going to do the same thing on the way up. So no vomiting. Okay? Lavage. So lavage is stomach pumping. So we'll push normal saline in and out until the fluid that is being pulled out is a pale yellow and there is no debris. Number 4 is absorptive. So charcoal would be an example. And that's for specific treatments. Not all poisons will bind with charcoal to speed up the intestine and push the poison out of the body. And then soothing agents may be given for minor things such as milk of magnesia. So vomiting, let's do some takeaways. So caustic agents and then kerosene as well. So kerosene, unconscious patients, and caustic poisonings. So acetaminophen, also known as Tylenol, is usually abused more than anything. Poisonings aren't really common unless it's intentional, but it can cause severe liver damage if too much is taken. So you are going to have and I would know this, right upper quadrant pain. Tylenol PM for intentional poisonings, I would say, would probably be the most common, just because it's that sleep effect. So it surely has to do something. So it's unfortunate, but it happens. And then after the initial amount is taken, this liver damage is going to happen 3 to 4 weeks later. Symptoms prior than 24 hours, they're not significant. In the abuse, when they take that large amount, it's going to take longer for the acetaminophen. It doesn't mean that it can't happen, but typically they're not significant prior than 24 hours. Progressive liver failure, and that's going to be common with abuse and misuse. Over time, taking large amounts of acetaminophen consistently can lead to progressive liver failure, and that's going to be similar to cirrhosis. We can have severe metabolic disturbances, and you'll get a metabolic acidosis. And that's caused by CO2 and then oxygen disturbances and cellular death, right? So cellular death leads to endotoxin releases, which leads to those changes. So metabolic acidosis. Okay, so let's do a takeaway. So our takeaway, let's do over time. So if you're abusing, so this would be abuse, you're going to have slow progression. That's not spelled right, sorry. So slow progression, typically no symptoms. Less than 24 hours. And it's similar to cirrhosis. And then if we have an acute, so we have intentional, we'll have quicker symptoms. So this would be large amounts as well. Large amounts at once. At one time. And then we're going to have right upper quadrant pain. Okay, so this is some dosages to kind of put everything into perspective and how much you would have to take to have a poisoning. So for 200 milligram tablets, 5.4 grams will harm the liver, and that's 27 tablets. So you can see with that intentional acute, if somebody takes an entire bottle and there's 100 pills in the bottle, then we're going to have severe liver damage. That's when we're worried about more severe symptoms, okay? And then 10 grams will cause death, and that's 54 tablets. So misuse compared to misuse, abuse, constantly taking Tylenol every day, so many times a day, over time is going to cause harm to the liver, whereas in an intentional, taking too many pills at one time to harm oneself is going to cause those quick symptoms. And then that 3 to 4 weeks later, then we have severe liver damage. So treatments induce emesis or gastric lavage. So remember, emesis is the medical term for vomiting. Gastric lavage, pumping the stomach. So either of those we don't want to do if the patient is unconscious. Activated charcoal, because that is going to bind with the Tylenol, push it out of the system faster, and kind of inactivate it from causing more harm. So the amount that is taken is going to give us an idea of what type of treatment is needed. So we are going to want to get blood work. Q 2 to 4 hours. So every 2 to 4 hours. And we're going to do that for a 24-hour period. Okay, acetylcysteine, remember that's mucomist. Can be given to reverse, so we'll put that down here, reverse a Tylenol overdose. It's going to bind with it, and it's going to help the liver cells prevent damage, okay? So it's going to bind with it, and it's going to reverse with it. It's given Q4, and they have to drink it, so they ingest it. So drink Q4 for a Tylenol overdose. The patient can become combative, comatose, altered level of consciousness, and it does this because toxins in the blood become an ammonia, and it gives an electrolyte imbalance. Okay, aspirin is another common overdose we see, but it's not as common as Tylenol. It's usually going to be seen with young children, easy to get into the bottle, or teenagers with suicide attempts, but again, not as common as Tylenol. So some signs and symptoms: tinnitus, which is ringing ears. Fever, sweating, flushed, diaphoresis, hyperventilation, because we have a severe metabolic acidosis. And so with hyperventilation, it's our body's way of trying to compensate for that and get rid of some of the acidity. Delirium, convulsions, and coma are going to be with a higher amount of aspirin. So 35 milligrams per 100 mLs of blood is our toxic level. This is the toxic level. But it cannot be determined for 6 hours because of the way that our body absorbs it, and it gets into systemic circulation. So we need to make sure that we're consistently monitoring it. We are going to dilute it with saline to start off, activated charcoal or lavage, depending on how soon we find the poisoning occurs. Because if it's not in the stomach, then it's not going to be able to be lavaged out, or the charcoal is not going to be able to bind with it. Sodium bicarb is going to help decrease the respiratory drive, right? Because what happens if we are hyperventilating, and eventually our diaphragm is going to just poop out, and they're going to go into respiratory failure. And then hemodialysis to help with the kidneys, and getting those toxins out. So CRRT would be a good one. So that is the end of this portion of the lecture. So make sure that you understand some of those key terms, and then what is going to be used to treat aspirin and Tylenol overdoses. Be able to kind of look at a little scenario, see the signs and symptoms, and then what you think it is, and then what treatment would occur.